very warm welcome to this webinar on greening existing homes in South Africa. It's going to be an interactive one, so I'm looking forward to this presentation. And we will start off with thanking our sponsor for today, which is Lambdaboard. And I'm going to make a fool of myself, but I'm going to try. Lambdaboard is a flexible-faced polyisocyanated insulation board made on a continuous laminator. And I've got a guy here who can talk about that much better than I do. So please listen to this guy.
So the world has changed. Lockdown has opened eyes, particularly my wife's. She's found so many fix-up things for me to do. So I'm building thanks to Lambdaboard and my wife's keen eye. I found Lambdaboard has brilliant insulation, unmatched thermal properties, highest R value per thickness than any other thermal installation product commercially available. And you know what? Safety, of course, is a big deal. So Lambdaboard comply with all of South African national safety standards. Wow. Hey, it's proudly South African. The installation, it's going to last the lifetime of the building. It's eco-friendly. It's made from recycled bottles. In fact, last year, 1.2 million plastic bottles were recycled to produce it. How's that for zero global warming? So don't buy cuck, buy cool. Lambdaboard.
So you heard it. Buy cool, buy Lambdaboard. Welcome again, and thanks again to the sponsor. You're really making these webinars possible for CPD Point, all the attendees. So the webinar is hosted by the Regenerative Collaborative South Africa, which is a volunteer organization, and with the aim of bringing as much of information and education around sustainability in the built environment to you guys. Our previous events are still available, so if you have missed one of them, go to the GreenNet website, and we have a specific page on the website, RCSA, where we're hosting all the videos of the previous events, and they will still be available for CPD points. So if you're in need of CPD points, just go there and watch the video, fill out the quiz, and you'll get your points. I'm going to hand over to Thulani and Francois, who are going to be facilitating the rest of the session and talking about existing greening homes or greening existing homes. So Thulani, Francois, there you go.
Thank you very much, Marlus, for that introduction. Thank you. So basically, the approach that we want to take in this here webinar is that, there's Francois, thank you. Basically, the approach we want to take is that we'll be speaking to you as professionals as well, and getting your input in your experience as designers and practitioners and as professionals, but also to speaking to you as a householder. So your experience as well. And that's important because that will allow us to understand some of the dynamics. And the approach we're going to take in the discussion is that we'll go from general to specific. And within that will be just some highlights and insights in the project that we did. And we'll tell you a little bit about that project. And then we'll just illustrate some of the things that help us to get some insight. So we really, really appeal to you to participate freely when we get to that part where we'll ask for your input and some questions. So if you can just weigh in on those things that you're going to ask and put before you. I don't know, Francois, if you wanted to say something, just opening words before I jump into painting the context.
Yeah, thanks, Thulani. Thanks, everyone, for joining. I hope you'll enjoy the presentation. But as Thulani says, not so much a presentation, but a discussion which we'd like to continue after today in terms of how do we green homes in South Africa, not just new, but existing. So excellent. Thulani, you want to give us some context?
Yeah, so it was important to start understanding we had to first ask, when we say home, what are we talking about? But it was important to also understand the socio-economic climate, because how the information would be presented when it comes to the solutions that we come to, it was important to appreciate that. And a recent survey from Stats says that nationally, a third of children live with both parents, whilst 42% lived with mothers only. And then it mentioned that children in affluent provinces like the Western Cape and Gauteng were most likely to live with both parents. And then The second stat that comes out of that is that the percentage of those who attained grade 12 as highest level of education increased from 21.3% in 2002 to 36% in 2020. And that's looking at persons who are aged 20 years and older. I'm sure you're starting to draw certain conclusions. Then one last stat is that households that received at least one social grant grew from 30.8% in 2003 to 45.6% in 2019 and 52.4% in 2020. So that paints the socio-economic environment we're finding ourselves in. So when you're speaking green, are there competing priorities? How does it relate to the emergencies of life? Who are we speaking to when we talk about greening? So we'll get to that. And Francois, maybe you can paint a picture for us on this project now when we were grappling with some of these issues here.
Yeah, thanks, Thulani. So yeah, my name is Francois Retief, and I come from an engineering background, but as you may have gleaned from the start of Thulani's presentation here, this is not going to be a technical engineering presentation, and this is a discussion broader than that. And my own perspective varies in the residential market from legislative, where we do a lot of work on the SANS 10400 XA kind of regulations. Then we do a lot of sort of design work around how do we model thermal comforts in buildings, improve it, how do we do energy, water. And then the part of the work that I find extremely interesting and where Thulani and I have worked is the research on sustainability. And Thulani and I undertook a research project a couple of years ago now, I guess. We've undertaken some work in the residential space, and one of those projects was the greening existing homes scoping for Green Building Council and GIZ and Department of Environmental Affairs. So these are the perspectives we bring today, is our lessons and our perspectives on greening homes from all the work that we've done. Hopefully you'll find it valuable and the conversation can continue. Okay.
Good. So I want to just illustrate this to you, and would like you to get your inputs on this here question.
So what does sustainable living mean to you? If you guys could pop your thoughts in the chat box or raise your hand, it would be great to get a little bit of feedback here. We'd like to get some conversation and not just have you listen to us. Okay.
And notice that we're not saying what does a green home mean to you. So that question, the way it's formed, is deliberate. So we'd be interested in what you say and think. There's Claudia, who's broken the ice, not using too many resources.
Yep.
Thulani, there's also two hands up. One from Marty and one from
Etienne.
Etienne, yes.
Okay.
Etienne's got a one next to him, so I trust he got his hand up first, so let him go first.
Oh.
I don't want to steal his thunder, but it's being polite.
It's chivalry going on is very good.
Sorry guys, it was the wrong hand, sorry.
Oh my, okay. Marty,
okay, cool.
Go for it.
So for me, sustainable living is basically continuing with life in a way that doesn't negatively impact your environment in any way. So whether it's the way you're living, the food you're eating, the way that you go from A to B, whether it's vehicles, it's everything about life, doing it in a way that doesn't negatively impact the environment and allows things to be replaced and replenished that you use, if that is a layman's description. Thanks.
Excellent. Yeah, so everything about your lifestyle and how it impacts on the environment. Thanks for that. I see Sarah Olsen noting here also about lifestyle, transport, food, health is interesting. Okay. Kathleen, using renewable resources. So Janice is talking about being able to sustain yourself as far as possible, growing your own food, recycling, reduce waste, natural resources without harming the earth. Okay, so sustaining yourself is a concept that comes up.
And how's that comment from Joe as well on living holistically and consciously? So like if one was to just isolate those nuggets and key expressions. And that's probably starting to speak to why sustainable living as that's in the question there.
Interesting. Okay, great. It's good to see that living aspect come out through greening existing homes. Okay. Sarah's keen on the circular economy. So how we use our materials that come into the home, what we do with materials that come out of the home, managing our organic waste, composting. Okay.
So if I can just add to my thing, and having read some of the other comments, I think it's about balance in all aspects of life. So I think a lot of the comments are more, going around your living side, but then it's also about the place you work, the place you live, and buildings you engage with as well. So it's all of those aspects.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Martin.
Francois, can I just mention something else too here, which is also important for this conversation, is that reference to circular economy. And we found this more often than not, we talk sustainable living as doing less with certain things, and living efficiently with stuff. And often we forget the need of what about the abundance, dimension, about giving more than you take, And so that is also a key idea in this sustainable living, regeneration and creating abundance for yourself. And of course, if you're thinking next generation, that too.
Cool. Okay, so we're going to move on the similar theme, but we'd like to run a poll. So let's unpack this a little clearer. Try and choose the most important aspect to you in your home out of this list. So we're going to open up a poll. Hopefully that'll come up in a second. Great. So in the chat box, there's a poll. Select the single item that you think is most important to you and submit your vote. Okay, the votes are coming in. It's
Francois, you must vote as well, eh?
Yeah. No, my vote is in.
So we've got 27 of 77.
Good job, guys. Got 50% response rate. So if you're sitting on the fence, go for it. This is an easy choice, clearly.
Some people might have a black screen on the poll, so maybe not everyone can do the poll.
Okay. Cool. If you can't,
I won't judge anybody.
Yeah, I voted for you, don't worry. All right, the responses are still coming in, but maybe we can chat about some of these. So those of you that can see it will notice that the responses are pretty spread. Interestingly, a lot of people are choosing affordable energy and water as the most important. When we've done this exercise in the past, interestingly, energy and water didn't focus as highly. I think we've got a very energy and water conscious audience here, maybe. But you'll notice the strong prevalence of other factors as well.
And maybe it's something that hits the pocket or burns the pocket more than anything else, the ones that are there.
Topical.
Topical too, yeah.
So healthy food is very interesting. And we find that health, when we talk about a residential context, health often is a lot more important to people in their homes than it may be, in terms of commercial greening of buildings. Access to nature is huge. This is interesting. I'd love to know where the people who've chosen access to nature live, if you feel that you're longing or if you feel that you'd miss it. So access to nature, important. Walkable access to shops. Everyone's given every one of these got a response. And what we've been trying to do here is illustrate a couple of things. But we've come to a couple of conclusions here, and the one is that when talking about homes and our living in homes, things are a lot more personal and diverse than what we find in greening commercial projects, for example. It's not all about the return on investment. For some people it is, but for others, food may be their strongest concern. So it's very personal and it varies depending on the context of each household. And the other thing to notice here is that there's a huge spread of the diversity of issues that are important. Okay, so moving on from there, we'll look a bit deeper into how does one define sustainability, and we look to the Sustainable Development Goals. And the Sustainable Development Goals, this is a graphic by the World Green Building Council, which tries to unpack some of the Sustainable Development Goals that are very relevant to the residential sector, or that can be very well influenced in the residential sector. I'm going to unpack them a little further in a second slide. So these three, clean water and sanitation, affordable clean energy, and climate action, these are the three that are often on the table when discussing sustainability or greening of homes. But as we've just seen, the story runs far deeper. Responsible consumption and production. So those materials that are coming into our homes, how are they leaving our homes? What is happening to the waste, organic, recyclable, non-recyclable waste that is leaving our homes? And how can we impact that, especially in existing homes? So some of you may have had experience in greening new homes, developing homes, and you're looking at your waste or materials impact of the building. But in operations, this is hugely important, is how do we manage our waste? Then something that often is overlooked in the context of greening buildings is food. And some may say, what does the house have to do with food? But how able a family is or a householder is to access fresh food, whether it's literally access to retail outlet of fresh food, or whether it's access to land for growing fresh food. These are extremely important issues that can be affected in the way that we manage communities or the way that we operate homes. And then health and well-being we spoke about. Issues here could include factors around materials that are in your home. It could be factors around fresh air in homes, daylight in homes, things that are really important. And when you're spending a huge amount of your time in these homes, things that can have, massive health impacts. Another factor to consider here, especially in communities without access to electrification, is the burning of fuels, of harmful fuels in homes, and how can we manage that in existing homes in the South African context. At a community level, we can even look at issues like security and how can communities operate in a way that addresses security issues. Community groups on WhatsApp, for example, have been quite transformative in the way that we link community members and create community security. Or there could be more at a sort of public space perspective. We can have surveillance elements or natural surveillance elements that help from a security perspective. Walkable access to shops and schools are an issue here as well. And then life on land. So life on land from an ecology perspective, and if you look at the green building rating tools in our market even to date, often look at how can we do less bad when developing or when building homes in terms of getting rid of ecology. But in an existing home setting, we have this huge potential to increase the ecology of our existing infrastructure. And how do we bring ecology back into the residential environment, either at a building level, but also at a community level? How do we increase access to nature? And the reason I'd put number 9 here, there's a few areas that greening existing homes can address industry innovation and infrastructure, but internet connectivity is a massive issue. And as access to education is moving digitally, this is one of the huge issues in that space. Obviously, there's other ways of transforming in that space through the supply chain of greening existing homes as well. Okay, all this discussion around existing homes and the diversity of the issues within it. One of the major conclusions, that Thulani and I had discussed is that these issues are not limited to a select few within the country. You don't necessarily need to see greening of homes as an elitist experience, which some of us often do. You think greening homes, you think, okay, well, those that can afford solar PV or those that can afford to address issues in the environment. But actually, when you break it down to the Sustainable Development Goals, when you break it down to the discussions we just had, it's about common human needs. And greening of existing homes is a mechanism for addressing common human needs that we all share. So we all require access to fresh food. We all require resilient, affordable energy. We all require resilient, affordable, secure water. So I think the one thing we need to do as practitioners in this space and as householders ourselves is to break through that stigma of greening being an elitist movement, if you will.
But Francois, I wanted to mention that, it's just like in any discipline, there's a language that is developed so that folks can understand what it is that they're working with and working on. So as much as the climate change discussions have happened in the political or polity framework, sometimes when that is translated to people who are not working in that space, we take the same language and it's used there. Then folks don't understand what this thing is that you're talking about. But that's one of the things we got to appreciate is the importance of avoiding jargon or the languaging had to be right. In what is it in essence that you ask? Indoor environment quality. Somebody else, clean air captures everything. Fresh air captures everything that they needed to that. No need for air change effectiveness.
Exactly. I think terminology is huge, and when we enter into this greening of existing building sphere, as we will and we must, we need to position this as accessibly as we can for the householders in order to transform this and help people understand that we're not talking about mitigation or adaptation. We're talking about meeting basic needs. Is what they need to understand.
Yeah, and maybe Francois, before we jump into the findings, which is what I think folks are also interested in, could we talk about where regulations fit into all of this?
Yeah, sure. So let's talk about regulation for a minute. And in the regulatory space in South Africa, many of you may be aware that we have regulations in place. SANS 10400 XA, for example, there's a new version that's been released, and it helps us more in developing new buildings, but also as a guideline for retrofits, etc. In terms of energy efficiency. B is in that series is going to address water, for example. So imminently we'll have water regulations. Many of these, however, addressing the design and construction of buildings.
Okay, and we know about the 7th of December 2022 deadline. There's a scramble for some data and all sorts of things to comply with that deadline for EPCs. But could you comment on that nonetheless in relation to the resi market? For now, it's private sector and commercial and others. But can you comment on that? Because this project was about greening existing homes.
Yeah.
But yeah, can you comment on that, please?
Yeah, and I think energy performance certificates, many of you may know, the race is on. It's mandated to display energy performance certificates from December this year for, at this stage, commercial buildings, office, education and such. I think we need to prepare, however, for that moving into the residential space, because if we look at international precedents, for example, in the UK, for years now, energy performance certificates have been active in their market and on sale and even on rental of properties. That can be a factor, and it helps householders to make informed decisions when renting or when purchasing homes. So energy performance certificates not yet active in the residential space, but I would say it's imminent. But Thulani, you may notice that regulation only touches on certain aspects that we've been discussing. So energy, soon to be water. There's no legislation I'm aware of for access to fresh food, and there's no legislation I'm aware of for access to nature or levels of biodiversity. And
yeah, I mean the thing is, and this is where we're talking about. We're speaking to everyone here, and we also break that fourth wall so that folks can weigh in. But we're speaking to everybody here in their capacity as practitioners and as professionals and so on. But they're also as home owners or as tenants in a place. So there's certain things that are within their control. But it's really about, even as and I'll speak from a designer's point of view because of the bias that I have there. But it's about really going beyond what legislation says. So you're really going to first principles, to the fundamentals of how a human being would live in a place they call home, and what is involved in sustainable living, without being trapped by definitions and all the rest of it, but to get to the essence of it. And then you design a place that can facilitate that as far as you possibly can. So legislation then doesn't want to be stuck in the regulatory framework, but also you want to then just go to the fundamental principles and be able to do that. And if legislation, sometimes we've seen it clashes with those fundamental principles, but it's an opportunity, and I'm not encouraging revolt or anything, but it's an opportunity to push against it and deal with the city or municipality or whoever involved about the regulation or the bylaw. But this thing is hindering us, and that there's this problem we're trying to solve as well. But I think the main point I'm trying to make is not to be stuck on the basics, the bare minimum of what legislation says, just to go a little bit beyond that. But I see there's some comments here. Sorry, go ahead, Francois.
No, I was going to say the same thing. Let's
go for it. Go for it.
Okay. So Thulani, how far along can we expect to see EPC to see these EPCs penetrate residential space? Practically speaking, it's anyone's guess at this stage, as far as I'm aware. But I think the point that Thulani made is a really important one, is that we really shouldn't wait for legislation to inform what we do. That's not the intention of legislation. The intention of legislation is to make sure that there is a certain minimum that people can't do less than. But we often fall into this trap of just following the legislative framework. Legislation is not going to get us to a space where we will sustain life on this planet. Legislation is not going to give us homes that are conducive to sustainable living. That needs to come from first principles design, and it needs to come from designing for sustainable living. So I think Thulani's point is so pertinent, is to not get stuck in the trap of legislation framework, but to design for fit for purpose,
Now, there's a comment from Georgie, question, that there are these many housing developments around Johannesburg, and he's wondering why there aren't more sustainable living developments. Do you want to respond to that, Francois? I have to filter my thoughts. No, so, I have to. So I feel strongly about this, for different reasons. But you go first.
Sure. So Georgie, I think, in my opinion, it's because you haven't been asking for it. I think we need to take the onus on ourselves as consumers or as householders, and look to these issues and support these issues. And I think that's going to go a long way. I think the market responds very quickly. So if we talk about private sector housing, the market responds very quickly, and the more that we request these, the more we're going to see them.
Yeah, and also where the market is not quite in control, Francois, think of mega projects that are being done by maybe government rolling out these housing developments. Sometimes it's also a budgetary decision that they make. At the top of it is to deliver the housing stock, and that is the target. Let's deliver this thing. And the layer of sustainable living is sometimes seen still as a luxury, where they will take away a park or reduce the size of a park to get more units or to save more money, And you're thinking, but the nature deficit is a serious issue, But of course, in the deliverable, we've delivered 1,500 units. But how? Yeah. Anyway, let me not be running on about that. So those are some of the dimensions that I play. And somebody else made a comment, even for private developers, they are mentioning the issue on capital and saving money in that instance. But of course, that is the ideal way. And sometimes it's not even the developer, it's the designers themselves who don't put it in there.
Exactly. Okay, I think let's move on to another poll for interest. Speaking of legislation here, how many of you have experienced legislation prohibiting the greening of homes? We'd be interested to know if this has come up for you in the past. Have you experienced it? So the poll is in the chat box.
And Francois, if I may, maybe I'd be interested to hear Sarah's experience in the work that they are doing, especially when working across different communities and areas, if legislation has been prohibiting or enabling for the work that you do. Would you mind weighing on that, Sarah?
Thanks for asking. Yeah, to be honest, we've had difficulty penetrating the housing market because, to be frank, I think developers don't quite get the full picture of what sustainability is now. So they think, yeah, we'll throw a few solar panels on, we'll get water efficient, and then the job's done, and then we'll drive home in our SUV and we'll keep having meat 3 times a day. They haven't quite connected the dots on what true sustainability is about: access to nature, security, clean air, all those things we spoke about. So for a lot of developers, of course, cost is a big thing. Number one, is it going to affect their bottom line? But I mean, more and more, it doesn't cost more to build green. And if it does cost a bit more, it's negligible. And of course, the homeowners benefit down the line as their utility bills are reduced, for example. And so the sales marketing is improved. But yeah, there's a lot more we could be doing. We've got an application, and we're working with an informal settlement to say, how can we use our 10 principles to create a simple One Planet action plan for an informal settlement? What can we do a bit better at very low cost? Yeah, and legislation does make life difficult because sometimes it just stops things that shouldn't be stopped.
Right.
Anyway, that's all I'll say now.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay.
Go ahead, Francois.
No, I was going to say, there's an interesting picture emerging from that poll, is that actually perhaps legislation as a barrier to greening homes, and especially greening existing homes, is not one of the biggest barriers out there. It's not necessarily a roadblock. And if we look at a lot of the issues we've been discussing today, they can be facilitated within current legislation. It's just that we're not taking the conversation there. And I think there was comments about the commercial barrier, and perhaps it's because we're taking the conversation straight to the developers without taking it to the community. You know, a market of supply and demand applies in housing. Okay, Marloes made a comment about alternative building materials that are not approved in SANS, and this is a good point. There are instances where legislation can be a barrier, as we can see. 20% if we found that.
Yeah, and maybe another thing, Francois, is that on this cost issue, you know, there are different ways of viewing it. Is it a cost or is it an investment? And others, you pay for what you value, you know, and that's us as individuals and as practitioners. We do that, and the same thing happens, you know, with companies and developers. It's what they value. So sometimes it's not that it's more expensive to do this, but it's because they don't value it, you know, and that sometimes is what kicks in. And perhaps we could, you know, switch and change gears now and get into the findings, you know, that have come out of this.
So look, something that's interesting here is that what we've spoken about around the legislation barriers is that these are very much focused on new buildings a lot of the time, and you know what's in the control of the owner, but who is the householder in this context? You know, who has the power to green a home? Is it the owner? You know, only. What about the case of the tenant?
Yeah. So maybe just some numbers, because numbers often tell a story. Is that from the same survey we had earlier? I mean, I referred to earlier. It said that 84% of South African households live in formal dwellings. 84%. And in 2018, though, the General Household Survey stated that 35.3% of South African households own a dwelling, and 5.4% own land, and some 18.3% of dwellings owned by household are owned by one person, and 17% are jointly owned. So it shows that there's a large residential rental market that is there as well. So maybe that's a good place to start to talk about, you know, tenant greening, what power sits in or control within tenants. Your take on that, Francois, or from what we?
Yeah, exactly. Thanks, Thulani. And I think we found through the research projects and work we've done that a lot is in the hands of the tenant. So often there's this perception that tenants are powerless to greening their homes, when actually you break it down, much of the impact comes from the operations of that home. So how do we affect operations within homes? So we're often familiar with the behavior-based energy efficiency initiatives, for example. You know, so are you, you know, turning your geyser on and off, you know, lights, etc. Are you using efficient appliances, energy perspectives? Now, the interesting thing in South Africa, households, 79% of households use electricity as their main energy source. 8% wood, 3% paraffin, and 10% other, so gas, coal, these kind of fuels. So when we talk about energy efficiency, there's also this behavior aspect of the fuels that people burn in their homes. So here we're talking about health now again. So how do we ensure that people are using fuels that do not have a negative impact on their health? And as well as being efficient from an energy perspective. Behavior-based water efficiency strategies, we're all very familiar with, you know, the realities of the droughts we had in South Africa over the last 3-year period. And I know myself in the Western Cape, we had to take this on as a behavior aspect. It wasn't a case of, oh, we're renting, so we can't install rainwater harvesting. People took on massive improvements through behavioral changes. So that's quite interesting. In terms of food, there's growing food, there's food gardening, and there's barriers to these that need to be unlocked. Access to land, one of them. Access to skills, access to resources. Similar with recycling and waste. Recycling at home is a tenant onus. The barrier becomes whether that tenant has access to a recycling network. But still, it's a conversation at a tenant level, not at an owner level a lot of the time. The same with composting, dealing with organic waste. The materials you bring into your home. From a material perspective, quick quiz again. How many of you actually consider the environmental impact of furniture, equipment, materials that you either bring into your home or that you use in your home?
And that's whether you are specifying material in someone else's home as well, or when you are changing locations or home, or you are selling your stuff that you don't like anymore, or let me say getting rid of it, because you may not be selling it, you may be throwing it away and sending it to landfill, or and when you decide that, okay, we need a bookcase, what material is this bookcase going to be made out of, or something along those lines?
So we're busy putting a kitchen in our cottage here, and we had to make some material choices. Things like are you using melamine carcasses, which everyone does, and for the first time asked ourselves, how long might this last versus other materials, or is this material reusable or recyclable? And it was a very interesting conversation to have with the service provider. And at the end of the day, we found choices that were very sustainable and at a marginal cost impact. So I think the power of just having these conversations is quite an interesting one.
And Francois, you saw, we thought we would add the sometimes, because I think we felt it would probably catch quite a lot of people in there, because there are various reasons in that, like Jennifer says, where possible. So if it is possible to do that. And then obviously there being a need to do it, as well, being part of that.
Okay, but 34% yes. And this is quite an informed audience, I would say, if you're joining this call. 62% sometimes, 2% no. I'm sure there's quite a few no's in the sometimes, and I'm sure there's quite a few sometimes in the sometimes. So the point we're trying to make here is that this is not, greening existing homes is not just a conversation with the construction of new homes. It's not just a conversation with those that own homes and can make infrastructural changes. It's a huge conversation at an operational level with those that tenant homes as well.
Do you think it's worth mentioning that different places we went to? I just realized that maybe we just mentioned that to give folks a sense of what places, and environments.
Yeah, so in the research project we did with the Green Building Council, we surveyed 600 odd householders around the country in shopping malls, so good spread of demographic. And then we had focus groups, both in mid to high income sort of focus groups in the major metros, but also in low income communities like Cato Manor in KZN, or like Nyanga in the Western Cape, Alex in Johannesburg. Yeah.
And Polokwane, we looked at Polokwane as well. because the
Apologies.
rental market was mighty high there. And yeah, so Polokwane, Johannesburg, Cape Town, Durban.
And what was quite interesting in the conversations across the board, these same issues come up as we're discussing. You know, tenants are empowered when you break it down to common needs. Tenants do care, and tenants are empowered to do quite a lot within their homes. And the issue is not just sitting with owners of residential homes.
Okay, so maybe let's pick up the pace without diluting some of these findings. We've got two more areas. So we've spoken about what's in the control of tenants. What about the owner? Is there a big difference, you know, to what the tenant can control and what the owner control? And also in terms of, I don't know, the weight of it, the gravitas of this control, is there a huge difference?
Yeah, and we find that the issues that owners are in control of is far more the typical greening conversation that we've had. So these are issues which some of them can be hugely impactful. And the one I'll mention here is domestic hot water. So your hot water heating in the residential context, we found, you know, that can easily be 70% of a home's electricity use, and is something that is difficult for tenants to address. Behaviorally, you know, you can deal with geyser timers, etc. But making infrastructural changes to domestic hot water has a huge impact in the residential sector, and is something that owners, it often sits in an owner context. And you know, the same with lighting upgrades, renewable energy installations, etc. This is where we start talking about capital. So the owner upgrades are often where the capital may sit, but for the owner, the improvement of the asset is there, and the marketability of the asset is there. So this is an interesting conversation, but much more of those infrastructural changes sit with the owner. From a water perspective, we spoke about behavioral issues, but obviously also infrastructurally. Here's where we talk about water efficiency. Go ahead, Thulani.
And this, we found that the owner, for the most part, was not driven so much about conscious living. Some, yes, were, but others was just, I want to save on operating costs and be able to do that. And then they were motivated to make these changes. And now it's more on energy security being number one, not efficiency. Efficiency is not even a primary focus, but it's on energy security. Now I want to make sure that I always have electricity or energy in my home, and that's sometimes the drive on the part of the owner.
Yeah, what's interesting is we spoke about terminology, but for us in the, you know, as sustainability practitioners, you think of that term resilience, and what really came to the fore is the importance of resilience in the residential market. So, am I secure in the event of power failure? Am I secure in terms of my water supply? How resilient is that supply? Far more important than the conversations we've seen in the commercial sector from a sustainability perspective. Yeah.
Francois, could you weigh in on the comment from that Yolanda has made about old steel windows don't close properly anymore? So making a home airtight is impossible unless they're replaced with aluminium. So it's layered. There's the change from one material to the other, but there's the functionality as well, which impacts on you know, the indoor environment quality and a few other things, and also, you know, on energy efficiency and that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to sustainability in general, we need to appreciate, as we've seen, that there's a huge menu of items here. There's a huge number of issues to address. and you create your own importance list as a householder, and you won't be able to do all of them. I haven't been able to, install the solar PV system that I want to yet. Similarly to Yolanda, we had an apartment where we weren't able to change the steel windows, but it doesn't mean that striving for sustainable living is out of your reach. It just means that one factor may be something that you can't yet implement. So I think the importance is to see bigger than the issue of energy or water, and see past the asset improvements or the costly improvements.
Okay, great. So before we move on to just the last aspect on now looking at community greening, so going beyond one's house or home, the one stat that I saw that I found interesting is that water and sanitation for households, that you've got 46, almost 47% of households have got piped water in the dwelling. And then you've got 28% piped water on site. So there's a pipe there, and then maybe it's you've got to then connect it to your home. And then there's 12.5% that share a communal tap. And then 1.8, there's a water carrier, and 1.7, they use the neighbor's tap, and 4% a stream, a river, a pool, and a dam. Would you like to weigh in on that? What's the effect on that, and your thoughts on the research on water consumption per person?
Yeah, so we've done some, benchmarking to understand what does water consumption look like, and it's interesting, obviously, to see how that varies, because if you've got a household with piped water in your dwelling and flushing toilets, and you possibly even have some landscaping, your consumption is going to be far higher per capita than someone who doesn't. And so the narrative we found should really not be how do we reduce our water consumption, but what is a sustainable level of water consumption? What is an equitable, responsible level of water to be consuming as a South African? Because some people in this country need to consume more water than they are. So, at a district level, in some respects, we need to increase our delivery of water if we want to serve all South Africans equitably. So that narrative, it may sound subtle, but it's really important that the narrative is not about reducing water consumption. It's about reaching, sustainable levels of water consumption. And we looked at how to model that, and you'll find that higher income homes are using 250 liters per person per day. Where water consumption in low-income environments can be right down to 20 liters per person per day very easily. So there's this massive gap, and how do we find that midpoint? And we found that perhaps the midpoint at the moment, if we were to follow the National Water Plan, and National Development Plan, may be sitting somewhere around 90 liters per person per day as a good goal for now. For 2030, we thought that may be a good goal. And we'd seen during the drought in Cape Town, for example, we pushed it as low as 50 liters per person per day. And there were some issues. There were some issues with that. So it's quite interesting to find that sweet spot of what is an equitable amount of water.
Interesting. So maybe a good entry point to this community greening, and the reason why we are including the idea of community is because of this holistic approach, because sometimes for that sustainable living, there are things that happen around you that would support that and enable that. So it was key for us to also look beyond just the four walls or the boundary of the site. But maybe that entry point into that part of sharing some of those insights in that would be talking about access to fresh food. Now, remember someone we met in Alex also said, look, the malls around us, in fact, it wasn't just one person. The closest mall doesn't sell the same. I don't want to mention the supermarket names, but this same supermarket close to us does not have the same fresh food as the supermarket that is X kilometers away from them.
Mm.
But then there's more attached to that, because 20.6% of households nationally consider their access to food as inadequate or severely inadequate. Can you start from there? Just talk about the insights we gathered there, what control is there and influence.
Exactly. I mean, 20% of households consider their access to food as inadequate. That is huge. And access to food may also imply, financial access, etc. But it starts with access to fresh food, and that may be the location of retail outlets with access to fresh food, or it may be the location of land for agriculture. And I don't know if we found in a lot of the lower income communities that we did visit, these areas really had restricted access to both, restricted access to retail fresh food distance-wise, and also restricted access to land for growing fresh food. So you're stuck, right? You also found incredible community solutions, though, to fresh food, and local producers and small entrepreneurs bringing food into these communities, which was incredible. But it begs to question, how are we planning our communities and how are we managing our communities from a food perspective? And can we bring those distances down? Can we bring the access to food closer? And I see there's a note on community gardens, which is excellent. We went to a community garden in Nyanga. We had a conversation there with the community, and it was incredible to see how this community initiative can improve food security and improve skills transfer and improve access to resources for agriculture. I think can be a really important, one of the really important solutions looking forward.
And the incentive there in the few places we looked at was not just limited to let's create jobs. It wasn't just job creation, but also just it being a fundamental need, and also a skills, an opportunity to transfer those skills to others, and just wanting healthy food as well. So as a solution to a problem where the retailers were not having or carrying fresh food there, making it available.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So Thulani, I'm going to jump forward a little bit here to a scenario in community. We're talking about sort of low-income communities often as well. It doesn't have to be low-income communities, but especially in low-income communities, what happens when the services that have been provided, what happens when they break? So in particular, we had conversations in most communities, but especially in Cato Manor. We went to a green street project where there had been actual greening interventions put in some years prior in 2017. One of them being hot water cylinders, for example. And what happens when this technology breaks? What happens when greening infrastructure breaks in those communities? Yeah, I don't know if you had any thoughts to add to that, Thulani.
Yeah, that there's an ecosystem that would need to be created. So if one is working on it as architects and engineers, you're working on this project, is to also think just beyond, the requirements of your discipline, that, okay, we're installing this technology, but when it breaks, where are the parts coming from and who's going to be replacing them? Okay, there's an opportunity to train folks to install the installation, but okay, when it breaks, then what? And sometimes it gives that technology a bad name, that it's not the technology that's wrong, it's just being able to replace it, because the tenant or the householder wants the thing to function. That's the main thing. The other stuff is not of interest. Is not of interest to them. So that is important. And then the other interesting insight on this was the social acceptability of the technologies that are available. Now, there was an interesting thing there on insulation, and we can safely say it wasn't Lambdaboard, not because they are the sponsors, but it wasn't it. What was the reaction or response to that? Do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, sure. So it was really interesting. So one of the initiatives put into this community as part of the Catamana Green Street was insulated ceilings. And this insulated ceiling product that was installed had a huge impact in terms of making homes more thermally comfortable. But the feedback from householders, some of it was around, why are we being given, this packaging styrofoam, the rats are nesting in this stuff, it's caused problems. So it's really interesting to understand the dynamics of social acceptability. A material that is acceptable in one context may not be acceptable in another, or may require, education alongside. So that was a really interesting issue.
And one can say that the person was also, or the people we spoke to, and they were sharing their experiences. They did find rats in their own homes as well, and they ascribed it to this insulation because that's where they were having a festival there. Now on the veggie gardens, I think one of the insights we got was, if there's an opportunity for you to put up to put up a room outside for somebody to stay in for rental space. Folks chose to go that route because there was an assurance or security that there'll be rental money or income coming from that, as opposed to a food garden. And I think it spoke to, not that there's no interest in the food garden, but it's or the veggie garden. It's more on what fulfills the needs at the moment.
Yeah, exactly.
And of course, Graham can provide a cat or two. He says,
Yeah, we need to go back to natural pest control. So that point is interesting, Thulani, is competing priorities. So we've seen this in a lot of communities from the aspect of vegetable gardens and growing food, is that space is highly valuable, and often, for example, in some of the Catamana homes we visited, what was a veggie garden had become a spare room that's now generating income, and that's just more important in that aspect. So here's where interesting solutions like, I can't recall who raised it, but interesting solutions like community food gardens or allotment, opportunities could present themselves where there's dedicated land made available for agriculture, and it doesn't have to eat into the usable space of that householder, which is very precious.
Yeah.
Something I do want to mention, though, which was very interesting, I thought, in growing food. So the vegetable gardens had not done so well in the Catamana Green Street, but the fruit trees had done excellently. So it's also about selecting, food, growing food that is appropriate to the level of maintenance that may be available in those areas. So the fruit trees were still producing really well in that climate, especially, and the residents were very happy for that. So growing fruit doesn't have to be a maintenance-intensive vegetable garden only. Fruit trees was an interesting solution.
Yeah. No, good. So I think in essence, I mean, I said, I mean, in response to Graham's comment, I said that, that my tongue firmly on my cheek. The importance in any, and in these kind of situations is, I mean, yes, there's litter that's a problem, but, sometimes it's just going beyond some of those issues that are there. So it's not always limited to litter. We find litter in Sandton and as well. but it's that holistic approach that you wanted to continue to permeate every approach, that one follows in these interventions. So looking at greening existing homes, I think in essence, this where to from here is more of a so what type question, in that we've considered all of these things and there are certain findings. None of it is earth-shaking or super revelation that most of you don't know. But in looking at this study is that it's, greening homes, speak to common human needs, as we firstly highlighted. I think that's an important takeaway on that. So what does that tell you? Then that informs how you design, how you come up with certain interventions with a social, and you've got to understand the symbols that are attached to some of these things, and any initiative that you put in there.
I think, Thulani, that's really important. So this is not as I mentioned, it's not greening is not just for those that can afford it. It's about what are the core common needs we have, and don't forget about those, even if they're not listed in legislation, for example.
Yeah. And where in a poor community, they are used as guinea pigs for technology, or any initiatives. And that's important, those sensitivities. And then there is, not to be limited by the legislative framework or the regulations. So first principles, those fundamental principles are key. And then the next one would be to encourage impact at all spheres of influence. So with tenants, owner, and community. And the reason for community is that you need other enabling services and initiatives to surround that. So it's got to go beyond your home, whether it is done by the developer or the community itself, or the tenants. They begin to influence this idea that will be able to create the change that is desired in that environment. And then another point is provide these services in an ecosystem. So if it's a technology, one must understand, its end of life, what happens then? And all those decisions have got to be made upfront. And even if it means, we get off our high horse and we actually walk and find these people who are able to provide these things. I mean, you could connect with people who have the spaza shops close by, and if it's a builder's warehouse as well, is to make sure that they have these things and within reach. And then is there a program that could be put in place where folks are trained to handle or to replace this technology? And then you create an ecosystem. I think that's the point that we're trying to make.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at the domestic hot water, solar water geysers, for example, there were interesting conversations that started to happen in our team about the potential for capacitating local suppliers in the community. Can you train up local handymen in the community to service these systems? Can you create local agents for parts for these systems? And then you're actually keeping the income and the spend within the community. You're capacitating the community to service themselves. So very, very important, I think, that issue.
And then final point is on understanding the local context, which also ties in with the first. Now, we maybe would have played bingo, so you can hear catchphrases like embodied carbon and life cycle assessment and EPDs and that. But you'll find that the ideas and the concepts are sitting in some of these things that we found in the work that was done here. I don't know, Francois, if there's anything you want to comment on, and before we hand over to Marloes.
No, I think that's great. So as Thulani said, this is not earth-shattering stuff, but we were confronted with, through the work we've done, we are confronted with these simple points that we feel are going to be really important in moving the journey of greening existing homes in South Africa.
Great stuff. There may be questions or comments that somebody is dying to make, but it's very nice comments that are being made in the chat box, and we appreciate you participating there. But Marus, I'm gonna hand over to you, or we'll hand over to you. But thank you to the folks for listening in to this. And if there's any comments and questions, anyway, let me just do just that. Hand over to you.
Great, thanks guys. That was super interesting. I really love the interactive session and the polls and the feedback from the people on the call as well. I think it's a good way to make these webinars a little bit more interactive for our purposes. So I'm just going to round off, and I would just want to mention to those who are interested in our next upcoming events. Next month, we're going to talk about EPCs and net zero existing buildings, probably more on the commercial side. EPCs are applicable to the commercial side. So we will have a chat, invite somebody to come and speak about EPCs and how do we actually going to get to net zero on existing buildings, because it's not as easy as it always sounds, right? And then in April, we want to have a similar discussion, but then around new buildings. So how, does the regulation, is it sufficient to push us towards net zero, and how can we design net zero buildings, and is it as easy as we think it is? And then in May, we're going to talk about regenerative agriculture, slightly different topic, slightly off the building side, but I think nevertheless a super interesting topic. So yeah, if you enjoyed this webinar, please join us, follow us on our social media platforms on Facebook and LinkedIn. I posted the links earlier in the beginning of the webinar. And I also have a special request, because last time I was asking for somebody to help us on social media, and we actually got a response on that. So this time I'm going to ask for somebody that has some IT tech skills that can help us with cleaning up these recordings so that we can post them quicker onto our website. So if you have any, IT skills and you are willing to help us and volunteer a couple of hours of your time on a monthly basis, we would really appreciate it. So, or if you know somebody that can help us around that, that would be really great. Okay, so then lastly, I want to thank our sponsor again, Lambdaboard. Great. Thank you so much for making this webinars feasible and providing the CPD validations for these webinars. And then I'm gonna, because the first one was so funny. Here we go.
Okay, let's talk about board, Lambdaboard. You'll never be bored. Why? Because it's versatile. Yes, it does roofs, cavity walls, ceilings, and underfloor. I said that way because ceilings are above the floors, but above the ceilings, it can be used on a concrete roof with approved waterproofing membrane. RigiFoam lets your installation meet the South African National Standards Energy Code. And talking about energy, it saves electricity. You'll probably get a thank you note from Eskom. It's so good. My wife, remember her? She's always looking for me to do new projects. I'm just having a hard time convincing my wife at this moment we don't need to build anything at this moment. But don't buy kak. Buy cool. Lambdaboard.
Great. And then I really want to thank our RCSA team, our Regenerative Collaborative South Africa team. With all these volunteers, these webinars would not be possible without your input. So really, really thank you for all your input and help and getting these out there to the industry. And that's it for today. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm really impressed by the attendance today. I've seen a lot of familiar names, so thank you guys. Really appreciate you joining us. And thank you to Thulani. Thanks, Francois, for joining us and facilitating the great discussion. We really, really, really appreciate it. You can come back next time again. With that, have a great evening, everyone, and looking forward to host you again next month. Cheers.